this organization has succeeded because of the combination of the work of the past presidents and the first ladies throughout the years. That's what's made it viable. At the first meeting, they held a banquet here in Chicago for the price of $1.50, and they were treated to a fine meal. I suggested to Brother Devine that perhaps we should emulate that here, but he thought the pricing was perhaps something that wouldn't be achievable. So we have prepared a DVD that shows a little bit of the history of the organization as it evolved. ARDA came into business after the pioneers had moved across the West, after the railroad industry had been put together. Martha Schoonmaker of Georgia Tech University told us about the town of Marion that didn't want the iron horse coming through, and the town of Withers had died. That took place in the first 3/4 of a century before ARDA began. When ARDA began, the railroads had been built. The legendary railroad builder, James J. Hill, said that land without people is a wilderness. People without land is a mob. And that is really the role that ARDA has tried to fill ever since that time, bringing people with entrepreneurial ideas together with the land the railroad controlled and trying to establish what now exists in terms of industry and commerce around the railroad industry. 14 members were involved in the founding of ARDA, and their logos are displayed here. One of the most obscure is coming up here in just a little bit. The New Orleans, Mobile, and Chicago. I had to do a little research and tours to find out what that was. And this DVD was prepared by Susan Ferry. Susan worked with us on a DVD before, and she volunteered to put this together. And I told her, I said, if you can come up with a logo for the New Orleans, Mobile, and Chicago, you will win a special prize. I haven't figured out what that is, but sure enough, within a week she had it, and it will be here in alphabetical order here momentarily. We don't unfortunately have pictures of the early officers in the first decade or two, but beginning in the 1920s, AR proceedings began to contain photographs. We're fortunate to have the 3 photographs that are displayed at the back of the room from some of the early meetings. But this organization was founded as the American Railroad Industrial Association, but its name quickly changed to the Railway Development Association. Our president, as we went into World War I, and we had the first villain in ARDA's history who came along, and that's him right there, Mr. William McAdoo. He was the head of the USRA, and he said, what you guys are doing, we don't want done. And so the organization basically went underground for a couple of years. The agricultural development people who came in essentially with the ID people began to become a part of the effort during the World War, but the industrial development folks were gone. They just were not to be forgotten, because on the day that the USRA finally surrendered control back to private ownership, we had the emergence of letters going forth from the previous folks who'd been the shepherds of ARDA, and lo and behold, the very same day the letters went out, they had their meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio, that fall of 1920. And at that point, they adopted the name American Railway Development Association. That's the name that went into World War I, and that's the name that came out of it after the meeting in Cincinnati. I wondered why there were so many meetings in Cincinnati early on, and I found out that both Mr. Mance, the original president, as well as Hal Fullerton, and you remember I shared with you a year ago a poem that is a verse that his wife, Edith Morgan, put together on the Railway Development Man. And he was also born in Cincinnati, Ohio. That's the first published picture in the ARDA proceedings of President Hill. Of course, these pictures you can study much more closely around the back of the room. We have photographs of the group that gathered in 1924 in Savannah, Georgia, 1927 in Detroit, Michigan, which you see here, and in 1928 in Miami, Florida. That's don't know who's who within them. We don't have any identification of who these folks are. I mean, I'd love to know which one is Hal and Edith in those. They're in at least one of them. Russell East, I mentioned earlier, he was a pioneer using his first name. This woman became the queen of the Lions Club in Omaha, Nebraska, a gentleman named Val Kustra, who was an active member of this organization in the 1920s. He promoted her to be the queen of the Lions Club in great competition with representatives of the other companies in town, including Union Pacific. She won the election and then he married her. So he was definitely a promoter. When I went through some of his files, which fortunately are in the Nebraska State Historical Society, I discovered some really humorous correspondence when there was some misinterpretation of some of the early colonization and immigration activities of the railroads. And lo and behold, the word got out that he was running, or his predecessor was running a matrimonial bureau. And some of those letters are definitely very, very humorous to read. There's Edith's little verse on the development man. Interesting. She was the first woman member. I think it was 1914, isn't that correct? 14, that she became the first official member. She was the assistant director of agricultural development for ARDA. One of the people who has been instrumental in preserving the history of the organization was a gentleman named Arthur Large. Arthur Large was the general agricultural agent, agricultural development agent for the Rock Island in Chicago. And Arthur not only was instrumental in putting together the early history of ARDA, which was published about 1930, but he also gathered all the proceedings and kept them in bound volumes. He had them bound to a book with his name imprinted on the cover, and he kept those on until about, I forget when the year was, but at any rate, he kept producing those, and he lived in Chicago. There's Arthur Large. For some reason, Arthur never became president of the organization. I'm not sure why, because the tradition of people moving through the chairs had been established step by step in the 20s, and Arthur was the secretary-treasurer, but somehow never became president. Yet he was an instrumental figure in the organization. He lived in Chicago, not far from here, and retirement into the early 50s. He was listed in each of the proceedings up to that point, but Lyman Horton of the Milwaukee Road was instrumental in taking Arthur's proceedings and presenting them to the Association of American Railroads Library in Washington, D.C. AAR, of course, in moving around and consolidating, decided they didn't have room for all those historic records, so they donated them to the Barriger Library in St. Louis, which is the National Railroad Library, and that is an instrument of continuing recording of the history of this organization. And so I finally found them. It took a few steps to find out where they went, where they were, but we finally did track them down, and so it provided a tremendous amount of detail of what went on in the history of the organization. These folks were all involved in the 30s and 40s, and as we moved into the World War II era, again, we had a cessation of annual meeting activities, but we did have continuing activity by the organization. ARDA early on met in Chicago every year. They also had what they call their annual meeting, but the annual meeting really got a lot less attention than the meeting in Chicago because of all the railroads that were headquartered here, and it drew many, many people from throughout the country. That's, the authority of a railroad is really emphasized by that particular slide. This is a material I found on Mr. John W. Barriger, and of course he is one that donated many of the books that began the National Railroad Library. We've had women involved in ARDA from its very inception, and there's a few pictures of women working on the railroad. Our first woman president, Cynthia O'Connor, is due to be here, of course, at this meeting. We had many a meeting, and the banquet, as you see here, was known as the family dinner. You begin to see, of course, as we move through the pictures, as you would if you went through your old family pictures, that the formal, staid look of never smiling or very rarely smiling was replaced with candid pictures, which began to appear, but you see the officers began to smile as we moved through the 50s and the 60s. Of course, the railroad industry at this point was kind of in the second boom period in terms of after World War II. It was very specter of government regulation of the river industry as monopolies continue to hang over the heads of the industry. The Distinguished Service Award was established, and you see a number of pictures in here of its presentation. There's a list of all the Distinguished Service Award recipients at the back of the room as well. And as we move forward, there's Lyman Horton presenting the proceedings of Arthur Large to the AAR. I had the pleasure of meeting Lyman at one of the early meetings that I attended. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But that's really the first picture that was other than a formal portrait of Lyman and the other officers there. There are many pictures interleaved in here from Frank Flynn. Frank Flynn of the Reading Railroad was a long-standing member of this organization, and his son created a real treasure trove of information by providing his proceedings, which began in 1847. And so that helped to fill in things great pictures, one of the Distinguished Service Award presentations, meeting at the Greenbrier. We began to have many more candid pictures of people and places and things going on during the course of these meetings. The emphasis definitely shifts based on the information that's available. I hoped his son would be here. That's his son and his wife, but unfortunately they couldn't come. So in the midst of a wedding anniversary celebration this weekend. See some of the faces of some of the folks who are with us today, and unfortunately not everyone could be here, but 18 out of 30 is pretty darn good showing for an organization going back as many years as a number of these people went back. You'll see some of the familiar faces as they move along. Notice the logo is absent from the banner. I thought this was just a classic picture because it shows the beginning of the mixture of dress that was in vogue and how things have changed from what you see in the early photographs of the group. And every variety of dress, and of course that's certainly true today. A few of the folks in the audience will probably be able to pick themselves out of this photo. We began to get many more candid pictures, and the spirit of the organization comes through. The logo was put into ARDA's vote by Paul Blanchette, who's our longest serving past president, and unfortunately his wife is ill, he couldn't be with us, but been a very big contributor to this, including this photograph of the group that gathered in Montreal during Paul's meeting, went on an aerial tour. And that's Paul on the right. Several composite pictures published like that. Of course, you can study those and find many, many folks in there. Jay Warren, Mr. President, on that photograph of the Greenbrier, that's Paul Blanchette again. There's Mr. Lambrey right at the front and center. Ray had his meeting in Chicago. It was through Ray that I became aware of ARDA. Ray handed some literature on the associations of a gentleman I just hired, a young market analyst from Wisconsin who moved to Mokina, Illinois, and he gave that gentleman on the commuter train one day literature on ARDA, which that gentleman passed on to me, and that's how I became aware of the organization. There's Frank Flynn again. There's Joe and Mickey Sagley. Unfortunately, Mickey had knee surgery here a little while ago, and then on top of it, she broke a bone in the other foot. This is a meeting in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Charlie Catlett. Charlie mysteriously disappeared, unfortunately. We don't know what happened to him. There he's presenting the Distinguished Service Award to Fred Rooney. He's talking after receiving the Distinguished Service Award. The 75th anniversary was hosted by David Barber Cox in Williamsburg. try to do that in the 80s, 90s, and because of privatization and all, it was very difficult to accomplish. But it hasn't been done yet, but I think now with the railroads being privatized, we have Art Dominguez now working for Kansas City Southern, who has a major interest in Mexico. That's got to be one of the priorities of the coming decade. There's two guys that, boy, you'd think that was two brothers, but that's Glenn Highfield along with Jay Warren, side by side. I was talking to Glenn on the phone, and he said, the time I came to a meeting, everybody kept walking up to me saying, "Hi, Jay, good to see you." And he finally said, "I discovered the likeness," which that picture captures. There's Mr. Cox. There's George Toddy, and I really dedicate this presentation to George. George wanted to be here so badly. He, last time I spoke with him, he said, "I'll be there, the good Lord willing." Well, the good Lord wasn't willing, but George is just a true friend, a true Southern gentleman. There he is with his gavel plant. That's a picture with Al Keller, one of our past presidents. He also had some recent health issues. This is the meeting that Carol and I hosted in Omaha, Nebraska. We were going through the throes at that point of the Staggers Act. The Staggers Act changed the railroad world. It changed the railroad's economics, and it was the adaptation to the changes from the Staggers Act. And Gil has been centrally involved in that with his volunteering to be the executive director, and Maryland supporting him to keep this organization going and growing. The only way the organization has survived is because of the fact that you wonder where I got the idea for the attire. I figured anybody would recognize that was at that meeting in 1985. That's my kids. There's George with our two daughters at the meeting in Omaha. Agricultural development was the second big thing. Industrial development was there from the beginning. There was a letter from Linus Tumbleson of the Burlington Northern, and then Ron Cross of the Santa Fe was the other active agricultural development member when I first became involved in the ARDA of the 70s. And when I was president, all of a sudden I get a letter inviting me to the ITCHPAC, the International Conference on the Handling and Shipping of Perishable Agricultural Commodities, which turns out ARDA had co-sponsored with the AARs since ARDA and its agricultural development folks began in the post-war, about 47, they started to sponsor an annual event at Purdue. But ag development was a major thrust which went away from the organization. These photographs are from the meeting that Bob Mortensen posted in Philadelphia. Bob really wanted to be here, and he may still yet make it by Wednesday, but I don't think so. There's Bob. But there's some really good canned pictures of various folks. Again, Frank Flynn and his wife at that meeting in Philadelphia. Frank and Joe Thompson. Chuck Tucker and his wife. Chuck was one of Al Keller's associates of the Grand Trunk. And of course, we recognize the Coxes there today. Paul and his wife. They have Paul with us today. Paul Olson. Doug Hills chaired our Constitution Committee for about 20 years, where we changed the Constitution in the 1980s and early 90s about every other year in order to adapt the organization. Originally had a very strict membership requirement, and even to the point if you changed departments within the railroad, nothing you were out, you couldn't be a member. Well, that long faded from the scene with railroad mergers. The last meeting in Chicago was the one hosted by Jerry McArdle, with the Illinois Central. Woodstock, New Hampshire, that was where Centennial O'Connor had her meeting. Bob Haley's with us today. This is Bob's meeting in Kansas City. Thanks to Larry Collingwood having lots of photographs of that meeting. We're able to document that very, very well. Many, many people have contributed to the photographs that you see here, many of whom are not here, unfortunately. There's Bob Larson of the Wisconsin Central. Bob, unfortunately, can also not be here. His wife is critically ill at home, and he's caring for her. This is the meeting that Bob and Chris hosted for us in Egg Harbor, Wisconsin. Then we went west for the first time in a long, long time. You see some pictures of several meetings. Somebody might recognize her. This is the meeting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Some people have a pretty good time with these meetings. There's Larry Hills and his wife Shirley. Lambert's. Bill Krasinski and Colette. I love the musical coordination with this photograph. Working on the railroad on the belt. Galloway Gardens. Here we are. Everybody who was here remembers this, and I said that picture's got to be in there. The sprinklers came upon the folks who were dining shortly after that photograph was taken. Everyone who was there remembers that. Krasinski's meeting was in Washington, D.C. That's a Frank Flynn picture several years before that. We have the assemblage of past presidents and first ladies. The duck rides in Washington. Change from the formality of the early meetings to today's ARDA and today's board. Who's to say a meeting can be complete without Western Gulf. Pauline Sim, who was in Montreal. One of those guys that keeps coming back. Last meeting in Atlanta, Georgia.
That was John Trashford.
Just as we began with 100 Class 1 railroads when this organization was founded, and probably 20 or more companies that had their headquarters in Chicago. We've gone through enormous change in the course of the history of the organization. All of these logos representing the different companies that were involved in one way or another within the organization. It's quite a list. We had 20s and the growth in the roaring 20s, peaks of membership in that period of time, and then came the Great Depression, and then came World War II, and then came the rebound from that in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, until finally the burden of bankruptcies and other problems led to the Staggers Act, and finally taking the burden of monopolistic transportation regulation off of the backs of the industry. And of course, that immediately led to several things. One, it led to the demise of the market development group of ARDA, which was probably one of its strongest and most active groups, because people were afraid that somehow getting together and talking about anything related to commercial development was going to be a problem. And so that was probably an overstatement, because this organization never had any trust immunity. So when people talked about stuff like that, they should have been able to continue talking about what they talked about, and they're not supposed to be talking about pricing and activity anyway. But nonetheless, the whole industry had, through the rate committees up to the Staggers Act, it had antitrust immunity for those types of activities. The organization was basically put into crisis because of two things. One was the resignation of a lot of these market development folks, whose law departments that don't continue, but also by all the mergers that then began, because that's what made the mergers come into fore. And when you look at the health of the industry today, we wouldn't have this industry in the healthy state that it is. You know, a century and 3/4 after it was founded, to have an organization that's viable, or an industry that's viable, and an organization that's survived a century. But it's only because we've changed, because we've adapted. And the ARDA has always been built upon the people and the land around and so the environmental group became very, very vibrant as part of the growth in the land freed up by mergers and facilities being made obsolete. And through the efforts of Gil and others who shepherded some of the seminars that we had, workshops, that led to the growth of the organization that leads us today. Large or small, everyone gets one picture in this. If you're on the membership roster of companies during the past year. Thank you very much. And a couple of things I want to say relative to ARDA's first century. First off, the people are fascinating. I wish I could find out more about some of them, and maybe we will yet. But ARDA's hero and couple were Hal and Edith Loring Fullerton back in the 19-teens. In between, we have all the many, many first ladies and past presidents who served this organization throughout the decades. But the people who are the hero and heroine couple of the last decade are certainly Gil and Marilyn Dickinson. And we have prepared a memento for them. And you can pull this tab on the top, and it should any rate, I wanted you to know that these folks, you know them, of course, through this organization, and they're everybody's friend. And for a quarter of a century, my wife and I hosted a St. Patrick's Day party in Omaha, Nebraska. And Gil and Marilyn drove down from the Twin Cities virtually every year. Sometimes a snowstorm would get in their way. And Marilyn would play the piano, and Gil would just turn on his fine tenor voice, and they would do the musical presentations at that. So these folks are true friends to everyone they meet, and we prepared this plaque in recognition of that. You'll start the bus.